I mean, I was just walking down the street and they came up to me like they was important or something. They start pushing at me, man. They pushed me into this alley, not like a alley, but like a hallway. And at the dark end of this back spot of the hallway, they start punching at me. So I curl up in this ball on the floor so they can't hurt me, nothing. But if I had a couple of guys, buddies, like fighters, like my friends, I wouldn't have to be you or nothing. Just a couple of three buddies, they could see I got these buddies here. See, see, I'm on H right now, so I'm flying, and I gotta talk, but I'm serious now. Just a couple of guys, maybe they wouldn't mess with me so much. You see, I got some buddies here. I mean, they kicked me up. Oh, man. If I was on H right now, oh, there'd be pains all through my body. And I'm out there walking the streets by myself. I start wondering who out there's gonna mess me up next, because I can't protect myself. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You know what I mean, Just a just a couple buddies, like couple just a fighters, like guys that like if you walked around with these guys, man, you could do man, you could do anything. Balm and Gilead. It's a play by Lanford Wilson. Personal connection, probably the second most famous Missouri playwright after Tennessee Williams. Plays written in 1965, which I'll come back to in just a second as to why that's really cool. Character is named Fick. Fick is described as a pathetic, childlike junkie. So those are three inciting words that are very specific and should give you a clear idea of who this guy is. We'll get to how you can fiddle with that in a little bit. But first, just cool context story. Lanford Wilson's written a lot of great plays. I think he won the Pulitzer in 1980 for 5th of July. Also a great play. This is his first ever full-length production play that was produced. He moved to New York in the 50s and he started getting the idea for this play, hanging out in cafes, just eavesdropping on kind of the low lifes that would hang out there. And by cafes in the research, I assume it meant bars, but maybe both. Um, what's cool about this, and it comes into New York in the 60s, written in 65, it's a contemporary play of the time. Um, Nowadays, we understand heroin addiction not clearly very well at all on a case by case, but a lot better than in the 60s. And so he's way ahead of his time, not just on explaining how these characters work, but also, the city of New York. People knew, you think of Taxi Driver, like late 70s, 77 or something, pretty much flip a coin on a De Niro movie, it's probably going to show how gross New York was in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And this play is focusing on that. So you have to understand for the character, uh, he's living in not just like a heroin addicted, disgusting state that you might picture people nowadays have to live, but there's not even close to the understanding of how these people get hooked on these drugs. There's no support structure for sure. There's nothing for these guys. So even though he's pathetic and childlike a bit, and he's chemically addicted to this drug, the society factors are just as important. So if you're performing a monologue like this, or really any period piece, and this isn't a period piece, but anything that is very important, what the date and setting is, research that time, because there's a big difference in not a huge difference, but there's a significant difference between heroin addiction now and heroin addiction in the 60s. Which will lead me actually right into analysis. Um, so, like I say every time, anytime you're dealing with a substance addiction, a medical condition, whether it's physical or like depression or mental, I should say, you really want to research it pretty thoroughly, because as soon as you know someone in your life who's dealt with that, if you see it on stage and it's not really close to what you've experienced, uh, that's going to immediately take you out of the reality of this. Not too personal, someone really close in my life had been a heroin addict for 10 years, jumped between the other ones, Xanax, all the stuff, tried selling methadone. And so when you know how these people act, and not to overgeneralize, but with heroin, it's a kind of a safer bet, because the combination of the chemical addiction and the lack of any societal structure, really, there's a small subset of people that you can kind of work with if you're playing a heroin addict specifically at this time. So I went onto Narcanon's website. Narcanon is sort of like a WebMD of drug addiction. They describe a few symptoms of heroin abuse and addiction, and when you can tell someone's currently on it. Um, Stuff like that is super important, because, especially with a monologue like this, the physical is just as important as the language. And the very first thing I have listed here, obviously, is accent. This guy's clearly, I mean, you could do this without an accent. It's not totally essential to play the character. Um, and a lot of people don't like accent monologues just as a principle. But this guy's a very New York guy, and sure, my accent probably sounds a little more Boston than New York. I kind of struggle with that one. But ideally, you got a really sharp New York accent for this. But anyway, so Narcanon's website says signs of heroin use might include dry mouth, itching, flushed skin. Nothing you can really do to fake that. Fading in and out of clarity, itching, like I said, self consciousness about needle spots and injection sites, and euphoria, specifically at the moment and shortly thereafter of taking heroin. And when you read this monologue, for all these, I post the text right below the video, so you should have that accessible to you, as well as a link to the play. Um, as I always say, read the play. It's a fantastic play. Um, Probably a nightmare to direct, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But with all those possible signs of heroin use and abuse, you've got a lot of things you can work with and play with in this monologue to give it some life and depth. I almost combine those words, um, because no one wants to watch just a pathetic junkie. I mean, you could; it's been done, but it's not that interesting, and it really limits the use of this monologue if you don't make dynamic choices. I wrote here punctuation, because on a review of this monologue, if you look back at it, there's not a lot of internal punctuation until there's a semicolon right after "I'm serious now." And at that point, I think is a really great choice, where you can again create sort of two structures of this monologue. The first bit is sort of that euphoric ride of taking the heroin. Now, what's interesting about it, and where you can play with the emotions of it, is he's telling a story about him getting the crap beat out of him. But he's clearly, and he says he's flying on H. He's clearly got this euphoric feeling, but he's telling this story about how pathetic and sad his life is. He's got no friends he can even walk around with. And so, in that first part, you can really, really balance that out to create some cool emotional moments where you see the understructure of a person, a character, someone that isn't just a pathetic childlike junkie, masked under this sort of euphoric rise. Then Lanford Wilson does such a great job, and again, way ahead of his time for understanding how to write these characters. With the punctuation, as the monologue goes on, there's a lot of hyphens. There's a lot of repetition. He goes, "You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You know." a lot of pauses. If you're cutting this monologue down to a minute, you probably do want to cut out that whole last sort of distracted segment because uh, sure it's good for this character, it's good for this monologue, but it's not going to do anything structurally for an auditioner that they haven't already seen earlier in this monologue. But what he does a great job writing is sort of that fall into that losing clarity. Um, Itching, like I said, I think the big three for me are the euphoria, the falling in and out of clarity, which are all kind of clear in the text, and then the actor's choice, the cool one for me, is the itching, um, because there's a lot of drugs can lead to that symptom, um, but you want to be really smart physically with this. So he's pathetic, he's childlike, he's guarded. So I made the choice to sort of do most of the monologue kind of hugging myself a little bit. It's just a naturally guarded position. Um, and a lot of times when people speak, actors or coaches or acting coaches and directors will get so frustrated if you fill moments on stage with it's written in this character, so you have to. But the itching gives you an opportunity not to just verbalize those moments of thought and changing trains of thought, but to physicalize it. And when you have that itching, it becomes really clear, oh, this guy's not fully functional right now. And, ideally in the first 3 or 4 seconds of this monologue, they're going to be able to tell right away, if they don't know it already, this guy's playing a pathetic childlike junkie. Because you can show that right at the beginning. And if it's consistent and interesting, it's a great monologue. I wrote, picture the situation that he's telling the story about. So talking about him getting beat up in a dark alley with no friends. Now, specifically for the first half, picture that, but your first emotional instinct is euphoria and happiness. And that'll lead really well to be able to create that balance of when does reality slip in, like, oh my gosh, I'm telling a terribly sad, painful thing, with, well, I just feel great right now. And you don't want either of those to supersede the other. I've seen the first time I did this monologue, I was way more pathetic and like crying about it. Just doesn't work right, because then suddenly it's not a heroin addict, it's a guy talking about him getting beat up. If you go the other way and you're just like so distracted and junkied out, you lose all interest. There's no interesting narrative. So for you, you've got to balance that. And I think a good way to do so is to imagine the pain of the story, but through a happy lens. Um, like I said here, you know what I mean, you know what I mean, you know what I mean, sort of fading out. That's indicative to me of that fading in and out of clarity. That's a place where you can make a really, each of those you know what I means can mean something different. The first one, to me, seemed like just a common sense, you know what I mean, just a follow up. Then he's losing clarity, he's losing train of his thought. So the second one is trying to recapture that, you know what I mean, you know what I mean. The third one is, oh yeah, he knows what I mean. Oh, you know what I mean, you know, and it cuts off there in the text. And I think that's where and then the next several lines are like 2 words at a time between hyphens. And I think that's a clear indicator from Lanford Wilson and for the actor to start losing that clarity really quick. But you don't want to end there. Like I said, you can cut that part out if you're shrinking this monologue to a minute. The end there where he says, if you walked around these guys, man, you could do anything. Shoot it right back up. But not the heroin. Ooh, probably should have phrased that a little bit different. Shoot the emotions right back up in that moment, because he's seeing like, wow, if only I had some friends, some support, some strength, my life might not be shit. And for him, that's euphoric. And for you as the actor or as an analyst, you might think that's still not probably going to work and not a really great long-term solution. but for him it's huge. So you can lead the directors, the casting directors, through this journey of like falling out into this addiction, come right back up and remind them of the person behind this guy. Um, I said I'd jump back. I'll jump back real quick. When you read the play, you'll notice almost all of the play is overlapping scenes. It all takes place in this one bar where there's just low lifes of every kind. But this is the end of the first act, and it focuses in, I believe, even with a spotlight on just Fick walking around, sort of talking like this. I think he's even described to be walking in a circle. Clearly, in the text, it's like a metaphor of he's the victim. He's an example of the victim of everything we've seen here. And so you want to be kind of disgusted by him, but you want to feel sympathy for this guy. So Lanford Wilson does that, focuses on this monologue so much that you as the actor should give it the same respect and realize this isn't just a monologue about a junkie. This isn't just, a monologue for character pieces. This is supposed to represent people being trampled in society. So, in conclusion, like I said, fantastic, fantastic play again, fantastic monologue again. You should use it for certainly if you have any character that or audition for a drug character. This is a great one you can work with in a lot of different ways. And if they don't mind cutting it up a little bit to, again, bad choice of words, cutting up the monologue a little bit to craft it to whatever you want to play, leaves a lot of flexibility for that. Probably should use the New York accent and sharpen it more than I did. Probably not necessary for every audition, but helpful and helps with the cadence and the pace. Um, Check it out. And again, if you've got comments, if you've got if on the performance, on the notes, on things I missed, other monologues I should do, feel free to comment below and like, subscribe, the whole shebang.